All right, let's take a look at the barbell bench press. This is a great full upper body exercise and one of the staples of our program because it works so many different things in coordination together and is really great for kind of strengthening up our chest, our shoulders, and everything kind of in that area. So first off, what we'll do is we'll take a look at how to set up everything for it, and then we'll get into what to do for the exercise. When we're setting up the bench press, there's a couple things to keep in mind. So a few different configurations of things you'll see. I'm gonna be using a squat rack for this one today. Sometimes you'll also see just a bench press station where it just has essentially a couple of hooks like this and the bench laid out. So there's a bunch of different areas to do this. The biggest thing is if you're gonna be lifting heavy, you wanna make sure you have some way of catching the weight, making sure that you don't get injured. So whether that's using a friend who's there as a spotter who can catch that weight if you can't make it back up, or using a squat rack like this, and we've got these catcher bars. So these are these guys down here, and you can move them up or down depending on your size. What you wanna make sure is that the level of that catcher bar is above the level of your chest. So when I'm down on the bench here, if I was to do a rep and I wasn't to be able to get back out of that, that weight is gonna hit the catcher bar and I can just slide out from underneath it. So it's only maybe a centimeter or so off my chest, really, really close, but it saves me if I wasn't able to lift that weight up and I was working out by myself. The next thing that you're gonna set up is gonna be the height of the bar. And this one, it always takes a little bit of experimentation when you first get started. Once you get used to it, you'll know, and what I like to do is when I'm recording my weights that I'm lifting, if it's at like a commercial gym where you can't mark everything yourself, I'll count what number of holes up from the bottom is, or some squat racks will actually have all these holes marked and they'll have a number to correspond with it. So I'll just make a note when I'm doing bench press, it's this specific number. Because this is a personal weight rack, I can do whatever I want. I actually just have little sticky marks right here. This one just says bench press, and then I know exactly where to set that up. And so when you're setting this up, how this looks is gonna be a little bit different depending on what brand of weight rack it is, where you are. But the one that I've got here, you twist this to the side, pull it out, and you've got the piece here that's gonna slide in. So you slide that in, it locks in. After I've got it even side to side, then what I wanna do is when I'm set up in this position, I want to have this essentially be at the very top of my range of motion. So here I've got just a little bit of a bend in my elbows, and I have just enough space to lift that bar up and off and get ready and set. And that bar is gonna sit kind of just over my chin or so. You don't want it too far up because you're gonna have to pull it back to balance it. You don't want it too far down and be too far this way. So I'm gonna set myself up. Hands are gonna be just a little bit wider than shoulder width apart. And from here, I'm gonna start my exercise by pressing up. And you can see I've got it set nicely because I just had to lift it up a tiny bit and forward to get it in place. When I finish my last rep, my elbows should be kind of locked at their full extension. And all I have to do is come backwards and set that weight back down. So that's how you figure out what type of a height. If you find it's a little too far and it feels like you're reaching, you move it down one hole. If you find that you have to lift it up really far to get started, then you want to move it up one hole. To do the bench press, it's a fairly simple motion, much like a push-up. So what we're gonna do is we've got our bar set, we've got our bench set up right in the middle of the rack, and we want to have it parallel just so that everything lines up. When you lift the bar off nicely, everything's gonna be lined up properly. From here, you're gonna lie yourself down. Make sure your feet are flat on the ground and your low back is flat and tight to the bench. Those are our two main things we wanna look for our lower body. You don't want your legs kind of resting on something or moving around. You want a nice solid stance on the ground. For that low back, you can kind of stick a hand in there, try and feel if you can actually get that hand underneath, and you want it to be fairly tight. You don't want to have a big arch in that low back. So once we're in place, we've got our feet square on the floor, we've got our low back in place, our shoulders and head are sitting nice and straight, and we're looking straight up, and that bar is right over about where my chin is. Then I'm gonna set my shoulders up on the bar. Hands are gonna come up just a little bit wider than shoulder width, and I'm gonna grab on. When I'm grabbing, I wanna make sure I have a neutral wrist. I don't wanna be bent this way, and I don't wanna be bent back this way. All that weight we want going straight through our hand and straight down. So from here, I'm gonna press up, lift that weight off the catcher bar here, and then bring it forward so that it's essentially suspended on a fairly straight arm over top of my chest. And from here, all it is lowering down and pressing back up. And so from here, you wanna lower down till that bar almost touches your chest, and then all the way back up again. You can take a little pause at the top if you need to, but if you are gonna pause, make sure you don't just lock out your elbows. You always wanna have just a little bit of a soft bend in those elbows. And you're gonna go through each of those reps, down to the chest, back up to the top again, down to the chest, up to the top. When you're finished, all you need to do is have those arms fairly straight. You're gonna lean back, and that weight's gonna go back into the hooks up top. To adjust your difficulty on this one, you're gonna increase your weight by 2 to 5 pounds on each side. There's a couple of modifications that we can do for bench press. The first is if you're finding that it's bugging your low back just a little bit. Sometimes people will be fairly tight through there, so having their feet all the way down on the floor can just put a little bit too much force through the back. So what you can do is kind of on the extreme end of things, you can actually lift your feet up and set them on the base of the bench. And have those knees bent up above you. That's gonna relieve all that stress off that back. It's gonna make sure that you're able to keep it nice and flat. If that feels like it's almost too much, over time what you can do is you can set up a box or you can set up something else at the foot of that bench and gradually lower the height of that so that you can eventually end up with your feet on the floor as you build some strength through this area. The other thing that you'll find sometimes is that just the mobility of your specific shoulder can be a little limited in some areas and you'll have a little more mobility in other areas. And so if you ever find it just feels like something isn't quite right or you're not able to move through a nice clean range of motion, you can play with the angle of your arms a little bit. So when you're set up there, you should be pressing down to here and up again. So those arms are traveling in the same path as the bar. However, sometimes based on kind of the mechanics of your shoulder socket, how that joint is built, sometimes that doesn't feel very comfortable. So what you can find is you might need to drop yourself down a little bit. You might need to come down even a little bit more. You can kind of play with the angle of those arms and you can play with how far up or how far down the bar is. And what that's gonna do is it's gonna really let you play around with things and find for you what that best movement path of that bar is. Ideally, you want it centered straight across you and you want those arms moving in line with it, but sometimes that just isn't possible. If you don't have access to either a squat rack or a bench press, there's a couple of alternatives that you can do. Number one, with no equipment, you can do a push-up. The one problem with that, so the push-up is the exact same movement. The only problem there is that you're kind of limited up to body weight and then you can't go much beyond there with the push-up. The other option you have is a seated chest press machine. This one is also a great alternative, works all the same muscles in the exact same movement. The only kind of downside here is that you have a little bit less stability. You don't have to work as hard to control that weight because the machine guides you through that range of motion, but it's still a great option.